The portrait hung in the town hall of Millbrook for over a century, its subjects frozen in time, their eyes seemingly following anyone who passed. Most dismissed it as a trick of the light, but when restoration expert Lia Chen arrived in the autumn of 2010, she discovered something that would shake the foundations of this quiet New England town. The painting depicted 6 people standing in front of the very building where it now hung. The year was 1910. The subjects appeared ordinary enough: a stern woman in dark clothing, 2 men in formal suits, a young couple holding hands, and a child standing slightly apart from the others. Nothing about the portrait seemed remarkable at first glance, yet dozens of visitors over the years had reported feeling watched. Some claimed the eyes moved. Others spoke of an inexplicable coldness that settled over them when they stood before it. The town council had dismissed these stories as superstition, until Lia arrived with her equipment and her meticulous eye for detail. Lia had been hired to assess the portrait's condition and recommend preservation methods. She was known throughout New England for her work with historical pieces. Her reputation was built on careful analysis and attention to the smallest details. When she set up her digital camera to take high-resolution photographs of the painting, she expected to find the usual signs of aging: cracked varnish, faded pigments, perhaps some minor water damage. What she found instead would consume the next 3 months of her life and nearly destroy her career. The first anomaly appeared when Lia examined the digital images on her laptop that evening. She had zoomed in on the face of the stern woman when she noticed something impossible. The pupils of the woman's eyes were not painted in the traditional manner. Instead, they appeared to contain depth, real depth, as if the artist had somehow captured actual human eyes and embedded them within the paint. Lia adjusted her screen brightness. She checked her camera settings. She even cleaned her glasses. The effect remained. The eyes had dimension that should not exist in a flat oil painting. She returned to the town hall the next morning with additional equipment: infrared imaging, ultraviolet light, X-ray photography, the tools of her trade. The building was empty except for the janitor, Harvey, who barely glanced at her as he mopped the marble floors. Lia worked in silence, running test after test. Each result deepened the mystery. The infrared scan showed temperature variations in the eyes of all 6 subjects. The paint was warmer there than anywhere else on the canvas. Impossible for a painting over 100 years old. The ultraviolet light revealed something even stranger. Beneath the surface layer, there appeared to be writing, tiny words etched into the canvas itself, hidden under decades of varnish and dust. Lia spent 2 days carefully removing a small section of varnish from the corner of the portrait. She worked with surgical precision, using cotton swabs and specialized solvents. When she finally exposed the hidden text, her hands began to shake. The words were written in what appeared to be blood. Faded to brown with age, but unmistakably organic. The message was simple and chilling. They are still watching. They are still waiting. The discovery changed everything. Lia contacted her colleague Kylie Rodriguez, a forensic art analyst in Boston. Kylie specialized in authenticating historical pieces and had access to more advanced laboratory equipment. When Kylie arrived 3 days later, she brought a portable mass spectrometer and a healthy dose of skepticism. That skepticism evaporated within an hour of examining the portrait. The substance used to write the hidden message was indeed human blood. The chemical analysis dated it to approximately 1910. The same year the portrait was painted. Together, Lia and Kylie began a deeper investigation. They requested access to the town's historical archives. The current town clerk, Reese Montgomery, was a young man fresh out of college who seemed eager to help. He led them down to the basement of the town hall where decades of records were stored in file cabinets and boxes. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old paper. Reese explained that much of the material had never been digitized. Some of it had never been properly cataloged. He left them with a promise to return in a few hours. The first breakthrough came when Kylie discovered a leather-bound journal tucked between two accounting ledgers from 1911. The journal belonged to Annie Blackwood, a woman who had served as the town's unofficial historian in the early 20th century. Her entries were meticulous and detailed. She wrote about town meetings, births, deaths, marriages, and scandals. But the entries from October and November of 1910 were different. The handwriting became erratic. The observations turned dark. Annie wrote of strange occurrences in town, people reporting lost time, children waking from nightmares about the portrait, a pervasive sense of dread that seemed to settle over Millbrook like fog. One entry in particular stood out. Dated November 15, 1910, Annie described attending a town council meeting where the portrait was unveiled. She wrote that the artist, a man named Grant Ashford, had arrived in Millbrook 3 months earlier. He claimed to be a traveling painter who specialized in commemorative works. The town council had commissioned him to create a portrait celebrating Millbrook's 100th anniversary. Grant had insisted on painting specific people. He said they represented the spirit of the town. The stern woman was Margaret Whitmore, a widow who ran the general store. The two men in suits were brothers, Callan and Dallas Reed, who owned the lumber mill. The young couple were newlyweds, Joshua and Mary Pierce, and the child was Susanna Hart, the daughter of the town doctor. Annie's journal entry described the unveiling ceremony. The portrait had been covered with a black cloth. When Grant pulled the cloth away, the audience fell silent. Something about the painting disturbed them, though none could articulate exactly what. The subject's eyes seemed too alive, too aware. Margaret Whitmore, who was present at the ceremony, reportedly fainted when she saw her own painted face. Joshua Pierce grabbed his wife's hand and rushed from the building. Little Susanna began to cry and would not be consoled. Only Grant seemed pleased with the reaction. Annie wrote that he smiled in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable. He collected his payment and left town that very night. He was never seen in Millbrook again. But the journal entries did not end there. Over the following weeks, Annie documented a series of disturbing events. Margaret Whitmore began to waste away. She complained of being unable to sleep because she felt constantly watched. She died in her home on December 3, 1910. The doctor found no medical cause. Callan Reed started experiencing vivid nightmares. He told his brother that he dreamed of being trapped inside the portrait, unable to move or speak, forced to watch the living world pass by. On December 10th, Callan walked into the mill's machinery and was killed instantly. His brother Dallas claimed it was suicide. Joshua Pierce became increasingly paranoid. He boarded up the windows of his home. He refused to let his wife leave the house. On Christmas Eve, neighbors heard screams. When the sheriff broke down the door, he found Joshua standing over Mary's body. He had strangled her. Joshua was arrested and hanged 3 weeks later. The child, Susanna, developed a mysterious illness. She stopped speaking. She stopped eating. She died in January of 1911. Within 3 months of the portrait's completion, 5 of the 6 subjects were dead. Only Dallas Reed remained alive. Annie's final entry about the portrait was dated February 1, 1911. She wrote that Dallas had come to her home late at night. He was terrified. He said that Grant Ashford had not been an ordinary painter. Dallas claimed that Grant had told him a secret on the night before the unveiling. The portrait was not simply a painting. It was a trap. Grant had used a forbidden technique passed down through generations of his family. He had bound the souls of his subjects to the canvas. Their consciousness, their awareness, their very essence had been captured and imprisoned within the paint. That was why their eyes seemed so alive, because they were alive, trapped and aware but unable to move or communicate. Dallas begged Annie to destroy the portrait, but before she could act, Dallas was found dead in his home the next morning. The official cause was heart failure. He was 32 years old. After Dallas's death, Annie wrote one final entry. She stated her intention to burn the portrait. She believed it was cursed or worse. But the town council refused to allow it. They claimed the portrait was town property and represented a significant investment. Despite Annie's protests, the painting remained hanging in the town hall. Annie's journal ended abruptly after that entry. Lia and Kylie later discovered through other records that Annie Blackwood had left Millbrook in March of 1911 and never returned. She died in Vermont in 1957 without ever coming back to the town she had documented so thoroughly. Armed with this information, Lia and Kylie knew they needed to examine the portrait more closely. They returned to the main hall late one evening when the building was empty. Reese had given them a key and permission to work after hours. The portrait hung in its usual place, illuminated by a single spotlight. In the dim light of the empty hall, the subject's eyes did indeed seem to follow their movements. Lia set up her equipment while Kylie prepared to take additional samples. They worked in silence, both acutely aware of the stories they had read. Kylie was examining the eyes of the stern woman, Margaret Whitmore, when she made the next discovery. Using a specialized magnifying glass with built-in illumination, she could see microscopic details of the brush strokes. What she saw made her drop the magnifying glass. Within the painted pupil, barely visible even under magnification, were tiny letters. A message painted in strokes so fine they were nearly invisible. The message repeated over and over in a spiral pattern that drew the eye inward. "Help us, help us, help us." They found similar messages hidden in the eyes of all 6 subjects. Each message was slightly different. Margaret's plea for help. Callan's message read, "Trapped." Dallas had written, "Soul prisoner." Joshua's eyes contained the words, "Cannot wake." Mary's simply said, "Darkness." And little Susanna's eyes held the most heartbreaking message, "I want my mother." Lia felt sick. If Annie's journal was accurate, and if these messages were somehow genuine, then the portrait truly did contain the consciousness of 6 people. 6 people who had been trapped for over a century in a state of aware paralysis. Unable to speak, unable to move, able only to watch as the world continued without them. The implications were horrifying beyond measure. Kylie suggested they contact a colleague who specialized in the history of occult practices in art. His name was Callan West, and he taught at a university in Providence. When Lia called him that night and explained what they had found, he agreed to drive up the next day. Callan arrived with a stack of old books and a grim expression. He had researched the name Grant Ashford and found references in several obscure texts about historical occult practices. Grant Ashford was mentioned in connection with a group of artists in the late 19th century who believed they could capture more than just the likeness of their subjects. They sought to capture the soul itself. The technique, as Callan explained it, involved more than just skill with paint and brush. The artist had to obtain something personal from each subject. A lock of hair, a drop of blood, something that carried their essence. These items would be mixed into the paint itself. During the painting process, the artist would perform a ritual. Words spoken in an ancient language, symbols drawn on the back of the canvas. If done correctly, the subject's consciousness would be pulled from their body and bound to the painting. The physical body would continue to live, but it would be hollow, soulless. This would explain why the 6 subjects deteriorated so rapidly after the portrait was completed. Their bodies were trying to function without the consciousness that gave them life. But why would Grant Ashford do such a thing? What purpose did it serve to trap innocent people in this way? Callan had theories but no concrete answers. Some practitioners believed that souls trapped in art could serve as a source of power. Others thought it was simply about achieving immortality for the subjects, preserving their consciousness forever. The most disturbing theory was that it was done for the artist's own amusement, a God complex taken to its ultimate conclusion, creating life and controlling it absolutely. They needed more information about Grant Ashford himself. Lia spent the next 2 weeks tracking down every reference she could find. She contacted museums, libraries, and private collectors. She searched through digitized newspaper archives. She posted queries on academic forums. Slowly, a picture emerged. Grant Ashford had been born in 1875 in upstate New York. His father had been a portrait painter of moderate success. His mother died when Grant was young under mysterious circumstances. Grant showed artistic talent from an early age but also displayed troubling behavior. Neighbors reported that animals would die around him. Other children avoided him. He left home at 16 and traveled throughout Europe for several years. When he returned to America in 1905, he began taking commissions for portraits. Between 1905 and 1910, he completed at least 7 major works. After Millbrook, there was no record of him. He simply vanished from history. Lia managed to locate 2 of Grant's other portraits. One was in a private collection in Philadelphia. The other was in storage at a museum in Charleston. She contacted the owners and asked if they had noticed anything unusual about the paintings. The response from Philadelphia came first. The collector, a man named Lia Chen, said that he had always found the portrait unsettling. The subject, a wealthy industrialist from the early 1900s, seemed too lifelike. Harvey had kept the portrait in his basement for years because it disturbed his family. When Lia asked if she could examine it, Harvey agreed immediately. He said he would be happy to be rid of it. Lia traveled to Philadelphia with Kylie and Callan. They examined Harvey's portrait using the same techniques they had used on the Millbrook painting. The results were identical. Hidden messages in the eyes, organic material mixed into the paint, temperature anomalies. The subject of this portrait had been a man named Theodore Garrison. Historical records showed that Theodore died 3 months after his portrait was completed. The official cause was listed as a wasting disease, but the symptoms matched those of Margaret Whitmore and the others: loss of appetite, insomnia, a sense of being watched. Rapid physical decline followed by death. The museum in Charleston was less cooperative. The curator, a woman named Annie Foster, insisted that their portrait was simply a historical artifact with no unusual properties. She refused to allow Lia to examine it directly. However, Annie did send high-resolution photographs. Even from the photos, Lia could see the same telltale signs: the depth in the eyes, the unsettling quality of the gaze. Another trap, another soul imprisoned in paint and canvas. The evidence was overwhelming. Grant Ashford had created multiple portraits using this dark technique. How many others existed? How many people had been trapped and left to suffer in silent awareness for over a century? The thought haunted Lia. She became obsessed with finding answers. She stopped sleeping properly. She neglected her other work. Her friends and family grew concerned. Kaylee urged her to step back and let others handle the investigation. But Lia could not let it go. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces in the portrait. She heard their silent screams for help. It was Reese who found the final piece of the puzzle. He had continued searching through the town archives on his own time. In a box of personal effects that had belonged to Annie Blackwood, he discovered a letter. The letter was dated February 15, 1911, and it was addressed to Annie from a woman in Boston named Clara Ashford. Clara identified herself as Grant's sister. She wrote that she felt compelled to reach out after learning that Grant had painted a portrait in Millbrook. She warned Annie that her brother was dangerous. She explained that their father had taught Grant the technique for soul binding when Grant was just a teenager. Their father had believed it was a gift, a way to preserve the essence of important people. But Grant had become obsessed with it. He saw it as a way to exercise ultimate control over others. Clara had tried to stop him, but Grant had threatened her. He said that if she interfered, he would trap her soul in a portrait as well. After that, Clara had cut off all contact with her brother. She did not know where he was. She only knew that he was still creating these cursed paintings and leaving destruction in his wake. The letter included one more crucial detail. Clara wrote that there was a way to release the trapped souls. The ritual that bound them could be reversed, but it required specific components. The original brushes used to create the portrait, a descendant of the artist to speak the words of release. And the portrait itself had to be burned at midnight on the anniversary of its completion. Only then would the souls be freed. This information changed everything. Lia now had a potential solution, but it came with enormous complications. They did not have Grant's original brushes. They had no idea if Grant had any living descendants. And burning the portrait would destroy a historical artifact. The town council would never agree to it. Lia knew she would have to act without permission. She would have to break the law. But how could she not try? 6 people had been suffering for over 100 years. 5 of them had died as a result of Grant's actions. If there was even a chance of releasing them, she had to take it. Kylie and Callan agreed to help. They understood the risks. They could lose their careers. They could face criminal charges. But the moral imperative was clear. They spent the next month preparing. Callan searched for any living relatives of Grant Ashford. He used genealogy databases and hired a private investigator. The search led him to a man named Josh Ashford who lived in Oregon. Josh was Grant's great-great-nephew. When Callan contacted him and explained the situation, Josh was skeptical but intrigued. He had heard family stories about Grant, dark stories that were usually dismissed as exaggeration. Josh agreed to help. He said he would fly to Massachusetts for the ritual. The question of the brushes seemed insurmountable until Lia had an idea. If they could not find the original brushes, perhaps they could create substitutes using materials from the portrait itself. She carefully collected samples of the paint. Microscopic scrapings that would not visibly damage the work. She also obtained hairs that had been embedded in the paint. The forensic analysis suggested these belonged to the subjects themselves. Grant must have collected them as part of his preparation. Using these materials, a craftsman created 6 brushes. Each brush incorporated elements taken from the portrait. It was not perfect, but it might be enough to satisfy the requirements of the ritual. The anniversary of the portrait's completion was October 23rd. Lia, Kylie, Callan, and Josh made plans to enter the town hall after midnight on October 22nd. They would perform the ritual and burn the portrait. Reese offered to help by making sure the building was unlocked and the security cameras were disabled. He understood that he was risking his job, but he felt it was the right thing to do. The town of Millbrook had unknowingly participated in a great evil. It was time to make it right. The night of October 22nd was cold and moonless. The 5 of them met outside the town hall at 11:30. Reese let them in through a side door. They carried the materials they would need: the reconstructed brushes, a container of accelerant, matches, and the words of the reversal ritual, which Callan had translated from Latin. They climbed the stairs to the main hall where the portrait hung. In the darkness, illuminated only by their flashlights, the painted faces seemed more alive than ever. The eyes reflected the light with an intensity that made Lia's skin crawl. They sat up quickly. Josh stood before the portrait with the 6 brushes laid out on a cloth. Callan held a printed copy of the ritual words. Kylie positioned herself near the door to watch for any unexpected visitors. Reese documented everything with his camera, and Lia prepared the accelerant. At exactly midnight, Josh began to speak. The words were ancient and harsh. They seemed to resonate in the empty hall. As Josh spoke, he dipped each brush in turn into a mixture of water and ash, then touched it to the corresponding face in the portrait. Margaret, Callan, Dallas, Joshua, Mary, Susanna. Nothing happened at first. Josh continued to speak, his voice growing stronger. The temperature in the room began to drop. Their breath became visible in the cold air. The lights flickered even though they had been turned off. A sound filled the hall. It was difficult to describe. Not quite voices, but something similar. A chorus of release. of relief, of gratitude. The portrait began to change. The paint started to crack and peel. The eyes of the subjects lost their terrible depth. The faces became flat and lifeless. Just paint on canvas, nothing more. Josh finished speaking the final words. The sound stopped. The temperature returned to normal. For a moment, everyone stood in silence. Then Lia stepped forward with the container of accelerant. She looked at the portrait one last time. The faces were now truly empty. Whatever had been trapped inside was gone, released, free. She poured the accelerant over the canvas and frame. Josh struck a match and dropped it onto the soaked painting. The flames caught immediately. The portrait burned with unnatural speed. Within minutes, it was reduced to ash and charred wood. They did not stay to watch it burn completely. Reese led them out of the building. They walked in silence to their cars. There was nothing to say. They had done something illegal and irreversible. They had destroyed a historical artifact. But they had also potentially freed 6 souls from a century of torment. Whether anyone would ever believe them was another question entirely. The next morning, the burned remains of the portrait were discovered by Harvey the janitor. The town council was furious. An investigation was launched. But Reese had disabled the security cameras and there was no physical evidence linking any of them to the fire. The investigation eventually concluded that it had been caused by faulty wiring. A tragic accident. The town council accepted this explanation because the alternative was too disturbing to contemplate. The portrait was gone. Millbrook could finally move forward. Lia returned to her normal work, though she found it difficult to focus on mundane restoration projects after everything she had experienced. She stayed in touch with Kylie and Callan. They occasionally discussed their search for other portraits by Grant Ashford. There were at least 4 more that they had identified, but gaining access to them was proving difficult. Lia wondered if they would ever have another opportunity to free those trapped souls. She hoped they would. She believed they had an obligation to try. 6 months after the ritual, Lia received an anonymous letter. Inside was a newspaper clipping from a small town in Vermont. The article described the recent death of an elderly woman named Susanna Hart. The woman had been 97 years old. According to her family, she had lived an unremarkable life. But in her final days, she had spoken repeatedly about a dream she had experienced. In the dream, she was a child again, trapped in darkness, unable to move or speak. And then, suddenly, she was free, released into light. The family did not understand what the dream meant, but Susanna had died peacefully with a smile on her face. The article mentioned that Susanna had been born in 1903 in a town called Millbrook, Massachusetts. She was 7 years old when she died there in 1911, or so the official record stated. Lia read the article 3 times. She thought about the impossibility of it. A child who died in 1911, somehow living a full life and dying peacefully in 2011. It defied logic. It defied everything science and reason told her was possible, but she had seen too much to dismiss it entirely. Perhaps when they freed the souls from the portrait, they had not simply released them to death. Perhaps they had given them another chance, a chance to live the lives that had been stolen from them. It was a comforting thought. Lia chose to believe it. She placed the article in a folder with all her notes and photographs from the investigation. The portrait of Millbrook was gone, but the memory of it remained. Lia knew that somewhere in the world, other portraits by Grant Ashford were still hanging on walls. Other souls were still trapped in painted prisons, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to care enough to investigate, waiting for freedom. She did not know if she would ever find them all, but she would keep looking, because some mysteries demanded to be solved, and some wrongs demanded to be made right. Even if the truth was stranger and darker than anyone wanted to believe, the portrait had watched for 100 years. Now, finally, it could rest.